morning. We will go ahead and get started. I would have started earlier, but the battery in my microphone was dead, and I want you to hear me. It doesn't matter what you want. The church isn't a democracy, Tom. You should know that. We're going to start Matthew 16 this morning. I wanted to try to do the whole chapter, but there's just too much in here to do it all at once. So we're going to break it up into a couple different chunks. In particular, we're going to see that this chapter can be divided into two different sections. This first section is what we're going to look at this morning, where Jesus warns the disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is a pretty well-known passage where Jesus gives them this warning. They don't understand it, so on and so forth. But this comes after another interaction first from the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so there's an interaction that they have with Jesus. Then Jesus takes it and tries to apply it as a teaching lesson. And I say he tries it because it kind of falls on deaf ears. The disciples don't know what he's talking about initially. So we'll look at that in a moment. And then, Lord willing, next week, we'll look at the second section where we see an explanation as to what Jesus and then consequently his followers are to do. That is verses 13 through the end of the chapter. So we're basically breaking up the chapter in halves, first half and then the second half. And so in the next section we'll see information about Jesus' work as the Christ and the Son of the living God. Peter makes that declaration in Matthew 16 and verse 16. And what we'll see is that declaration, it doesn't fit typical expectations. And Peter kind of falls for the typical expectation, and he gets rebuked for that. And so we'll look at that next week, Lord willing. But for now, we're going to start at the beginning of the chapter. And one thread that is going to run consistent throughout the whole chapter, I'll try to bridge the connection when we end the chapter next week, is the idea of spiritual blindness. We see it initially with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In this interaction, they're going to ask Jesus for a sign from heaven, as if Jesus hasn't already done enough miracles in their sight. And so we see that the Pharisees couldn't, or perhaps in their case wouldn't, see what was right in front of them. And so they're spiritually blind. And consequently, we see the disciples fall into that same boat. They also fail to see what's right in front of them. We'll see it in this section at the beginning, when Jesus gives them the warning about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. We'll see it in the next section with what Peter says to Jesus. So for now, we're going to begin Matthew chapter 16. And this chapter begins in the first 4 verses with an interaction between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. These are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So I'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll talk about it. It says, "And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, 'When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah.' So he left them and departed." So there's an interaction here between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And notice that it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees who come to him. These are two different groups of people, and they're quite different. Within Judaism in this period of time, you had these different sections. We often call it different sects, that's S-E-C-T-S, of these different branches of Judaism. And so you have the Pharisees who sort of had a monopoly on teachings, and they're kind of the rabbinic side of it. But then you have the Sadducees who kind of have a monopoly on work around and pertaining to the temple. The priests are closely associated with the Sadducees. The scribes, who are the experts of the Jewish law, they are closely associated with the Pharisees. And so oftentimes in the gospel accounts, you'll see the scribes and Pharisees paired together, and then you'll sometimes see the Sadducees and the priests, in particular the high priests, grouped together. you don't often see the Pharisees and Sadducees come side by side and working together. It's kind of like when Congress works in a bipartisan way. It doesn't happen all that often. They're kind of, you could think of it kind of like a Democrat and Republican type thing, where for the most part they're at odds with each other. They have a lot of disagreements, some of which, when you get to the book of Acts, you see Paul kind of pins them against each other. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection, the Sadducees didn't. That's in that instance what Paul uses to pin them against each other. And Paul had intimate knowledge of that because he was a Pharisee. So they don't come together very often. But what we see is, despite them being typically very divided and not being hostile toward each other at times, they are united against Jesus. And then when you get to the book of Acts, they'll also be united against the church and against the apostles. And so you've got two groups of people that don't like each other. But what's the old expression? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So in that sense, they have a common enemy. And so they're going to try to team up to get him. And this is, of course, the purpose of their visit. We see that they come to test him. We see that in verse 1. There's something interesting going on here that you may not see without knowing the Greek behind it. This is one instance where knowing the Greek is kind of important because there's parallels that you may not necessarily see. The King James, if you have a King James, instead of test, they use the word tempting. And it's very interesting because it's the word peirazo, and this is the same word that's used when the devil tempts Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. This is the great story of the temptation in the wilderness. He's been fasting 40 days. The devil comes, he tempts him with these three different things. Jesus, of course, resists the temptation, so on and so forth. We've already looked at that. But the word that's used is peirazo, and it's the same word that's used of the Pharisees and Sadducees here in Matthew 16. And so what you have is a parallel between the devil and these Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus in John chapter 8 refers to some of these leaders as sons of the devil. And here in Matthew we see them living up to that name because they're doing the very thing that the devil did to Jesus back in Matthew chapter 4. It's the same word that's used. And so whether the idea is testing or tempting, you can see a slight difference in the connotation of those words. It can be translated either way. We see this is what they're doing here. And so Matthew is paralleling the devil with these Pharisees and Sadducees. And I think Matthew's readers would have been aware of that. So we see that they come and they're testing Jesus. And they test him by asking for a sign in verse 1. This might sound familiar to you because the Pharisees and the scribes, they did this already in Matthew chapter 12. And so this is the first instance of that in chapter 12. They come and ask for a sign. And this is when Jesus tells them for the first time there's not going to be a sign given except for the sign of Jonah. And then he elaborates what that sign is and so on and so forth. There's a few differences, though, here in this instance. For one, it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So you've got two groups coming together. But this time there's a distinction that's made. They want a sign from heaven. Before they simply asked for a sign. Now they want a sign from heaven. And so you kind of see they're stepping up what they're asking for. And what they're thinking, they don't realize Jesus is actually capable of doing something like this. But what they're thinking is they're asking Jesus to do something that to them they don't think he can do. So they're trying to trap him. They want to get him to try to do something he can't do. He'll try to do it, he won't do it in their mind, and then he'll look like a fool and so on and so forth. And perhaps he does something and maybe there's a way that they can entrap him into doing something perhaps illegal where they could arrest him and so on and so forth. But in their minds, they're trying to either humiliate Jesus or try to find a way to get him to be taken into custody. And so their idea here is to test Jesus. And of course, when you're testing the master teacher, it's not going to go well. And that's what happens with these Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus, in verses 2 through 4, gives them an answer. And this answer, it accomplishes multiple things. We see first that he highlights their hypocrisy, something that Jesus, they try to pin things on him, and he pins it right back on them. He's really good at this. It's as if he's the Son of God and he's all-knowing and he knows what he's doing, right? Spoiler alert, he is all of those things. And so they try to pin something on him. He turns it on them. He highlights their hypocrisy and really their short-sightedness and their blindness about the things that are going on right in front of them. And then he calls them an evil and a corrupt generation, which, as we've seen before, I think I touch on that maybe later. It's an allusion back to the Exodus generation. There's quotations from Deuteronomy that allude to the same thing. We also see that in mentioning, that says Johann, that should say Jonah. I don't know why it says Johann. Typo on my part. I don't know who Johann is, but that should say Jonah. In mentioning the sign of Jonah, he's also looking ahead to his death, burial, and resurrection. And that's something that he's going to do later in this chapter when he tells his disciples he's going to have to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and be killed there, but then be raised on the third day, so on and so forth. And so what we see in this is that, as we touched on in chapter 12, the resurrection is the best sign that can be given. It's something that you really can't deny, because it's not every day that someone dies and then they come back to life and then they never die again. That's something that even today has only happened really the one time with Jesus. We have the hope that that will happen for all of us later on. But for now, this is the sign that's going to be given, and it will be given, and here we are. So first we see Jesus, he points out their hypocrisy. And he points out how they're able to interpret the appearance of the sky. And this pertains to things with the weather. Now, he's not talking about something that's really scientific, or it's not like these are trained meteorologists going on, and even then they get things wrong anyway, so they're probably actually better than the meteorologists that we have today. They could look at the sky and they could tell whether it was going to be good weather or not. As Jesus says, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. So they could look at the sky and determine, just like we can. You can look at the sky and say, oh, it's kind of gloomy out. Well, we might get some rain or we might get some snow. You can look at the sky and you can determine what the weather's going to be like. And again, this just doesn't take a lot of skill. It's not that complicated. It's simply observing what's right in front of them. They can look, they can clearly see, oh, the sky is red, it's going to be stormy later. Oh, the sky is red tonight, that means we're going to have a nice evening. So they're able to interpret what's right in front of them. And yet, we see that they're blind in terms of what's right in front of them in that moment with Jesus. He uses this expression, the signs of the times. People take that and they try to make it apply to the second coming of Jesus. But notice that's not how Jesus uses it. And so people who take that and apply it to that, they're doing that out of context. What he's talking about is the sign of the fact that the Jewish Messiah is now in their midst, and they are denying him. They're doing just as Nazareth had done, and they're rejecting him. And so, just like you can see the sky, you can see what Jesus has been doing. They're asking for a sign, but Jesus has been doing all of these great miracles. He's raised someone from the dead. He's cast out demons. He's done things like, and maybe they didn't see this, but I'm sure they probably heard of it. He walked on water. He's fed multitudes. We've seen him do that twice, the feeding of the 5,000 and then the 4,000. We've seen Jesus do all of these things, and these are things that you can't deny that he did. They couldn't deny it. They saw it. They knew that these were real things, and yet they still say, well, give us a sign from heaven, as if those things that he's already done are not good enough. What we see here is that they are missing what is very obvious right in front of them. They're spiritually blind, and in this sense, it's not as if it's their own fault because they're not willing to see. It's not like someone who's born blind and they have that disability. This is someone who more or less closes their eyes because they don't want to see what's right in front of them. And so we see Jesus, he points out their hypocrisy. They can notice the weather. They can't notice that the Jewish Messiah is right in front of them. And then he likens them, and he did this before in chapter 12 when they asked for a sign the first time. Now he likens them once again to an evil and adulterous generation. And so as Jesus does in chapter 12 and verse 39, after they asked the first time, this recalls the description of the Exodus generation. You can look in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 35, also in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 5, when it's said of Israel that they are an evil generation. This is, remember, the generation, just as the Pharisees and Sadducees are doing to Jesus, this is the generation that tested God in the wilderness. We see how that fared for them. They didn't get to go to the promised land. We see a very close parallel with these Pharisees and Sadducees. Just as the Exodus generation tested God, they're testing the Son of God, and it's not going to end well for them. And when he calls them evil and adulterous, some take that and say, well, it's not like they're cheating on their wives. No, but they're unfaithful to God. That's the idea behind this. This is used often in the Old Testament to refer to them being unfaithful to God. Because keep in mind, the Jews are in a covenant relationship with God. Marriage is a covenant. It's a promise, a vow that you make to your spouse. And if you break that vow, then you have committed adultery. Well, the same is true in this sense with Israel. They've broken their vows to the Lord. They've been unfaithful to Him. And so Jesus is right in calling them an adulterous generation. And then once again, Jesus tells them, this is the second time now that He's mentioned this, that there will be no sign given except the sign of Jonah. He doesn't explain it again, because He's already explained it in chapter 12 and verse 40. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights, so on and so forth. We talked about that before. He doesn't explain it again because He already did. That's what the sign of Jonah is. People try to speculate that it's some other thing. Jesus explains what it is. I think we can take Jesus at His word. And this, of course, is alluding to Jesus' death, His burial, and then His resurrection. And the burial here is important. Otherwise, why mention that He's going to be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights? That's Him being buried. That's Him being in the tomb. They knew that He was dead. People saw Him dead. It's not like they could claim that He faked His own death, because He was in that tomb for 3 days. But then that tomb was empty on the first day of the week, as we know. So that is the interaction that Jesus has with the scribes and the Pharisees. And now we're going to see that Jesus attempts to use this interaction with those Jewish leaders as a teaching moment for His disciples. And again, notice I use the word attempts because the disciples aren't going to understand what He's saying initially. He's got to really drill it into their brains. But before we get to that, are there any comments or questions on anything so far? Not even CJ has anything, guys?
You did a good job, Dick.
Thank you, I'll take it. So, actually, before I get to that, I should read it. So this is chapter 16, verses 5 through 12. It says, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. But Jesus, aware of this, said, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that He did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So now there's this teaching moment that Jesus has with His disciples. And notice that Matthew predicates this with the fact that the disciples forgot to bring bread. And that's an important detail because that ties into why they don't understand what Jesus is talking about. Their minds are worried about them not having anything to put in their stomachs. That's what they're worried about. They don't have any bread. That's all that's on their minds. It's kind of like some people, the only thing on their mind is the next meal they're going to have, right? I can be like that sometimes. I'm thinking about, where am I going to go out after church today? So on and so forth. This is the case with the disciples. They don't have any bread, so what in the world are they going to eat? Now Jesus gives them this warning. And the warning is to watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. I don't know if Jesus just happened to use leaven as an analogy. It's a pretty common analogy in the New Testament. Paul uses it at least once, I think maybe even a couple times. He uses it in 1 Corinthians, for example. But bread is on their minds, and so when Jesus brings up leaven, that just totally throws them off because their lack of bread is on their mind. We see that in verse 7. They begun discussing it among themselves, saying, "We brought no bread." And so they think Jesus is talking about bread because that's all that's on their minds. But Jesus, of course, has something different on his mind. He uses the leaven as a metaphor for their teaching, as we see at the end of this section. So he says to them to watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The disciples don't know what in the world Jesus is talking about. And so, rightfully so, Jesus rebukes his disciples. Sometimes you got to be rebuked. Because sometimes he can be so short-sighted. They should have known what he was talking about, but they've got this other thing on their mind. And so first, Jesus says to them in verse 8, "O you of little faith." That's something that specifically to the disciples, Jesus says 5 times in Matthew. I don't recall off the top of my head which one this is. I think it's the 3rd or the 4th time. There's a couple more, if not one more coming, that Jesus will say to them. So first, he rebukes them because of their little faith. If I recall correctly, that's something that Mark draws out more, the lack of faith on the hand of the disciples. Matthew's one of them, so he may not want to bring as much attention to that. But here, Jesus calls out their lack of faith. And we see why Jesus says this. They're preoccupied with their lack of bread. They're so focused on this, anything else Jesus says. It's kind of like in the Charlie Brown movies, how the adults talk. It's the wah, wah, wah. That might as well have been what Jesus was saying to them. And part of their lack of faith, you got to keep in mind, remember what has happened before. And Jesus brings this up to them. This is right off the heels of the feedings of first the 5,000 and then the feeding of the 4,000. And so they've seen Jesus take little bread and be able to feed a giant multitude of people. So Jesus has proven to them that he's got authority over physical things like food, like bread, so on and so forth. And yet they still are preoccupied about their lack of bread. And so what we see is, just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees are doing, it's a little different. Theirs is perhaps more ignorance than unwillingness, although there is a little bit of, they're still short-sighted. They're failing to see what's right in front of them. It's not as if they weren't there, right? They've seen these things. They partook of that bread that Jesus fed to that multitude. They're in that number. And yet they're still preoccupied about the lack of bread that they have. And so you can see why Jesus says that they're lacking in their faith. Jesus has proven to them that he can do this, and yet we see that they are lacking in their faith. So Jesus rebukes the disciples, and this time he restates his warning. For him to say it again tells you that this is important. This is something Jesus doesn't want them to miss. Sometimes you say something and they don't hear you, and it's like, whatever. This isn't one of those times with Jesus. He wants them to make sure that they know what he's talking about when he warns them against the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Except this time he clarifies that he's not talking about bread. He says, "How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So if Jesus isn't speaking about bread, then what could this leaven be talking about? Well, you got to understand what leaven is. Leaven is something you add to bread and it makes it rise and so on and so forth. If you add just a little bit of leaven, it leavens the whole lump. That's what Paul talks about in one of his writings. And so just a little bit ruins the whole thing. And there's debate as to what Jesus means specifically by this, if there's a particular teaching or if it's just their way of teaching as a whole, because the Pharisees and Sadducees teach very different things. But what we see is, as Jesus talked about before, the tradition and so on, their short-sightedness. This, I think, is what he's talking about, given the interaction he's just had with them, and given the short-sightedness that the disciples are showing here. Jesus is proving why he needs to tell them this, because they are so short-sighted. So what is this leaven talking about? Well, look at verse 12. They understood that he didn't tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so they need to beware of what these groups are teaching and what they're doing. And again, we see why this warning is necessary. Because the disciples in this case are doing exactly as the Pharisees and the Sadducees had been doing. You think about the example of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus is doing all of these miraculous things in front of them. And it's not as if other people haven't believed him, because Jesus has drawn quite a following at this point. You think about when he goes to Gennesaret, and the people are just flocking to him, wanting him to heal their sick, and he does these things. And so Jesus, he's healing their sick, he's casting out their demons, he's raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, he's walked on water, he's calmed the storm. Jesus has done all of these things. These are things that witnesses saw. These are things that cannot be denied. And yet the Pharisees and Sadducees denied them. And it's not as if they're audibly saying, well, Jesus didn't do these things. But their lack of faith is a denial in and of itself. Their lack of willingness to follow Jesus, that is a denial in and of itself. And so they are denying what is right in front of them. And you take that example, and then you look at what the disciples are doing. And you'd think, well, these are the people that have been around Jesus the most. These are the ones who have been with Jesus in these intimate moments. Some of these things that Jesus has done, not everyone has seen. I don't know that everyone saw Jesus calm that storm, but the disciples in the boat saw it. I don't know that everyone saw Jesus walking on the water, but the disciples in the boat saw it. And so, if anything, these disciples should have much more faith than everyone else. And yet we see that just as the Pharisees and Sadducees are, these disciples are also short-sighted in their faith. And you take the specific examples of the feeding of these multitudes, the 5,000 first and then the 4,000. They've seen Jesus do this. They've eaten the bread that he gave to them. And yet they're still preoccupied about, oh, we didn't bring any bread over here. You see the short-sightedness of these disciples as well. Both of them are failing to perceive what is right in front of them. It's kind of like, I think this is a man problem. I don't think this is a woman problem. But sometimes you're asked to look for something in the fridge and you can't find it. You look all over the fridge, you're moving stuff around. And then the woman, whether it's your wife or in my case my mother, they go and they find it in 10 seconds. Does that ever happen to you? You can't see, ever emphatically said yes. You can't see what's right in front of you. This is what's happening with them. They can't see what's right in front of them. And the reason for that, this is what they have in common. They're different in the sense that there's more hostility on the part of the Pharisees and Sadducees. I think the disciples want to have faith, but I think they're just unable to have it at this time because of their own shortcomings. But what both of them have on their minds are the things of man rather than the things of God. We see Jesus bring this up to Peter in the next section. That's when Jesus tells of the things he's got to go and do. He's got to go to Jerusalem and suffer great things at the hands of the elders, be crucified but be raised on the third day, so on and so forth. That's when Peter says, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen." That's, of course, when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And what he tells Peter is, you've got on your mind the things of man rather than the things of God. That's what Jesus says to Peter in the next part of this chapter. And what we see is this is what's happening in both of these instances with the Pharisees and Sadducees and then with the disciples. For the disciples, it's simply their stomachs. They're worried about their next meal. For the Pharisees and Sadducees, it's more of a power dynamic. They don't want some Jewish Messiah coming in and taking their religious power from them because they've kind of got a monopoly on these different aspects. The Pharisees on the teachings and on the traditions, the Sadducees with the things pertaining to the temple. They didn't like each other, but they could coexist with each other as long as they just stayed in their own lanes. But you have Jesus coming in, and Jesus is going to turn things on its head. And I think they knew that, and I think they're also jealous of the authority that he had. The Bible says as much. And so in that sense, the things of man are on their minds. They're not willing to relinquish their power. They're going to do anything to stop him, even killing him, which is ultimately what they'll do. They'll have him killed. They don't drive the nails in. The Romans do that, but you know what I mean. And so both of these groups, what they have in common, they've got the things of man on their mind, not the things of God. And we will see that culminated in the next section with Peter's interaction with Jesus. And believe it or not, that's not even the most short-sighted thing that Peter does. Because we'll see later on, he's going to deny Jesus 3 times after he specifically said he's not going to. Any comments or questions? CJ sees he's got 10 minutes. He's going to...
I just had a quick question. And so Jesus says the world of teaching of the scribes and Pharisees here. And then in Matthew 23 he says...
You're getting ahead, CJ.
Sorry?
Finish, I'm sorry.
Do what they say and not what they do. So on one hand it seems like you have Jesus saying, beware of the teaching, but on the other hand in Matthew 23 he says, listen to it.
Well, there's a couple things going on. If you didn't hear CJ, he mentions how Jesus here says to beware of their teachings. He says to beware of their leaven, but he means their teachings. But then later on, he says to actually follow their teachings. Essentially, do as they say, don't do as they do, that sort of thing. So how do you reconcile those differences? Well, notice Jesus doesn't say to not follow their teachings. He says to beware of them. There's a difference. To beware of something is to have knowledge of it and to be cautionary towards it. That's kind of the connotation behind that. And so to say to beware of it is to say, hey, be aware and to know what is going on and what their motivation is, why they're doing the things they're doing, so on and so forth. So it's different to say beware of their teachings and to say don't do them, because that's not what he says. He says to beware of them. Everett?
You see Jesus rebuking them here. It's confrontation. It's a confrontation context, right? And for some of us, confrontation's hard. You know, we want to be kind and gentle with people, and we want people to like us. And what I appreciate, and I guess really admire about Jesus, is he's got backbone. And when he sees what these guys are saying and realizes how off base they are, they're part of this evil, adulterous generation, he's going to say something. You know, he stood up to them. And when the disciples get off track, he pulls them back in and explains to them what he meant by the leaven. It's the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees to be aware of that. And so there are times in our lives when we have to confront things. It may be very uncomfortable for us, depending on your personality. Some people are always looking for a fight. That's not me. And Jesus wasn't looking for a fight, but when someone brought it to him, he stood up. Because you often hear about Jesus loves the little children and he embraced them. And he did that. And he loves us. There isn't any question. But he'll correct us when we need to be. When we have that opportunity, we need to step in and have the courage and do it in the right way. He did it just exactly the way we need to do it the way he did. But confrontation is not always the easiest thing to do, but it's necessary at times.
Yeah. Everett brings up how Jesus had a backbone. And when the disciples needed to be rebuked, he rebuked them. When he needed to confront the Jewish leaders, he confronted them. He was willing to do all that stuff. And the modern religious world tends to portray Jesus in a sort of, the word I like to use is sort of a sissified kind of a manner. He's all love and no confrontation, and so on and so forth. Well, that's not the Jesus of the New Testament. He is loving, like Everett said. He did eat with tax collectors and sinners and so on, but eating with them is different than tolerating their behavior. That's not what he does. He calls people to repentance. That's his consistent message in the gospel accounts. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He calls people to repentance. He calls them to leave their sin, and so on and so forth. And that's important for us to have that as well. And I don't like confrontation, but sometimes you got to dig your heels in, and you got to take the bull by the horns. And Jesus has an advantage that unfortunately we do not have. Jesus was aware of their thoughts. He was aware of their hearts. We're not aware of those things when we're dealing with other people. Sometimes we may think a person needs to have their cage rattled. That's an expression that one of my preacher friends, he doesn't say he's a preacher, but he is one. That's an expression that one of my friends likes to use. You rattle their cage. Some people might respond well to that. Some people respond inversely toward that. And so we don't have that knowledge that Jesus had. He knew the exact approach to take. He could be a little harder on the Pharisees and the Sadducees because he knew their hearts. He knew that they're against him. He knows the things that they're plotting and so on. He knows that he can be a little hard on the disciples because they need a little tough love. We don't have that advantage. And so there's some tactfulness that we need. I think of what Paul says in Ephesians, speaking the truth in love. That's what we need to do, and we need to remember, because sometimes you get in an argument with people and you lose your temper and so on. We got to remember that we're dealing with someone that we should love. And the motivation for the correction should be love for the other person, not because we want to be right, not because we want them to feel bad about what they're doing, but because we love the person and we want what's best for them. And that's why you don't tolerate some of the sinful behavior in people's lives, and you could fill in the blank with whatever that might be. Don?
Jesus says we should become as little children.
Yeah.
And little children, they'll get in an argument or something, but the next thing you know, they're hugging each other.
Yeah.
So we should have hearts like little children.
Yeah, Don talks about how Jesus said to be like the little children. And little children, at least boys, girls, I don't know if they do this as much. Maybe they do, but boys, they'll get in a fight, and then they'll be best friends a couple minutes after. The short-sightedness and being able to forgive and so on and so forth, that's important. Tom, you have something?
I think it's interesting that the Feast of the Unleavened Bread was, the purpose behind that was to remember what God had done for Israel, bringing them out of Egypt. And with Jesus calling the Pharisees' teachings leaven, and what they've done is they've distorted and they've added to, and they've taken what God has created, the pureness of what God has created in His Word, and they've destroyed it.
Yeah, Tom draws the parallel to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Passover, right? They take that with unleavened bread. That's why Jesus, when he instituted the Lord's Supper, that was Passover bread. That's why that was unleavened. That's why what we take is unleavened, because that's how Jesus did it. And the point of that meal is to remember what God has done. And you see, in just adding a little bit of leaven, they've distorted the whole thing. That's a good analogy, and I think it's fitting that Jesus uses that. All right, thanks for your attention.